Okay, it's 8:30 of Monday morning, and it's time to start another session of our investment banking course. Good morning to everybody, and welcome again to our course. Before starting the session, let me just comment briefly some of the results of the survey that we have filled in the past couple of weeks. As you remember, it was a midterm questionnaire submitted to students in order to collect their impressions and opinion regarding the course. And I take into great consideration your opinion because, as you know, my objective is always to try to deliver the best to my students. In general, I can say that overall, it seems that the course has been rather appreciated. There are some words of appreciation coming from you, class, and I'm very grateful for that. In particular, some of the elements that are most liked by students are the practical applications and the constant reference to reality, the possibility that what we are teaching is in line with what is required in your interviews, the fact that explanations here and there are pretty good, and so I really very much thank you for that. However, there are definitely some suggestions that you have raised, and I have already shared them with Professor Della Ragione. Among them, let me just tell you a couple that are recurring, reiterating. The first one is a lack of a textbook. But as you know, since the very beginning of the course, I told you that unfortunately, there is not a book in the press that is covering all the topics with the same degree of depth that we are looking for. It is something we are thinking about, but for the time being, unfortunately, there is nothing that we can use in order to complement what we are saying with the slides. Sometimes you say slides are, let me say, a little bit overworded compared to what is declared in class. Sometimes instead, slides are a little bit less, let me say, complete compared to what it is said during video lectures. Let me just tell you one final thing. Slides are a reference for us, and it is something that you must go through during the course. But putting together slides on one side, video lectures on the other side, and office hours, I strongly recommend you to attend office hours. If I look at what happened before the exam, only a handful of you asked me or Professor Della Ragione to clarify something. Please use them because it is a fundamental element where you can connect what is included in the slides and what it is said during the course itself. So this is just to say I have taken the first 5 minutes to tell you that I want to thank you for your enthusiasm and your positive feedback, and to say that we are taking into great account all the criticism, constructive criticism that has been raised, and that you have our promise that we will try to fix as many problems as possible for this second part of the course. So again, let me appreciate my sense of gratefulness for what you have delivered us in the questionnaires. Now, coming to the agenda for today. The agenda for today is, let me say, composed by two building blocks. The first building block completes the analysis of contractual mechanisms in private equity and venture capital. In the previous session, we analyzed a couple of weeks ago the private equity method, one single stage, multiple stage. And if you remember, we said that the multiple stage private equity method is set up in order to protect a venture capitalist or a private equity from the entrance of other investors at a later stage, in order to avoid essentially the dilution of the holdings. Just to give you an idea, if you consider one company that went public a couple of years ago, probably some of you are familiar with this company. It was one of the largest tech IPOs that took place some years ago, a couple of years ago, Lyft. Lyft was a poster child for multiple rounds of financing. If you count them and you see the amount raised in every round and the pre-money valuation, now you are familiar with what pre-money valuation is, you can see that there have been multiple rounds of financing. And so if you are the first private equity investor that gets into the scene and you don't protect yourself with a multiple stage private equity method against the dilution, calculating your retention ratio, at the end of the day, you could end up with a much diluted equity stake. So with the private equity method, multiple stage, we covered the protection of an investor against the entry of other investors. In this session, the first part will be dedicated to contractual mechanism to protect, let me say, to make it easier the exit of a private equity investor from an investment when the private equity investor is ready to exit. The second element that we will have a look at is another protection mechanism. And this protection mechanism is peculiar, particularly for, let me say, companies with a strong degree of intangible capital. Either because this is an highly evolved and, let me say, innovative company, or because it is at the early stage of its development. And so sometimes some paradoxical kind of effects could happen if we use the traditional participation in a company with a common stock. What we are going to do is to try to understand what happens if you use only common stocks in very young, very innovative firms, and how we can solve the potential problem arising from the use of only common stocks. And last but not least, in the final part, if we have a little bit of time, we will launch a bridge on the final part of this module, the replacement. And so we will turn completely the page, we will change completely a chapter, and we will open up the replacement capital, namely leverage buyouts. Okay? At any time, guys, at any time, if something should not be clear, should require any kind of in-depth analysis, stop me and ask me. More than pleased to help. So, just to introduce the agenda for today. The agenda is very simple. As we said, we will go through the following topics. The first one is the protection mechanisms to ease the exit of an investment. Protection clauses when you exit the investment. We will essentially look at two very common clauses called as drag-along and tag-along clauses. These are contractual mechanisms. So these are clauses, covenants, if you want, that are included in the investment agreement when, at the very beginning, the private equity investor gets inside the company. The second element is the analysis of the protection mechanisms for private equity or venture capitalists using instead not contractual clauses but security design. So essentially the idea is to try to move from a traditional common stock to something different. So we will abandon common stocks and we will introduce some other contractual design whose objective is to be in a position to help private equity and venture capital to protect themselves against unexpected negative effects when participating in a company. Last but not least, if we have time, we will start introducing replacement capital. an intro to replacement. And in particular, when analyzing replacement capital, we will basically look at Lbos. Okay? Very good. Okay, so coming to point number one in our agenda today. Suppose that you have an investment in your portfolio, and at a certain point, there is an occasion on either side, the founders on one side, or the private equity on the other side, to exit the investment. In general, the most looked after kind of situation is the founder and the private equity find an agreement to sell together, and so they exit. But sometimes this could not happen. And so the exit could become a little bit more difficult, or not necessarily agreed in between the existing shareholders of a company. And as you can imagine, this can create a problem for the investors. For this reason, when you sign the investment agreement, when you enter the company, when you enter in the company, you always include these two clauses known as drag along and tag along clause that are typical, let me say, a standard feature of a sale and purchase agreement when the private equity or the venture capitalist enters inside the company. How can I explain what a tag along and a drag along clause is? Well, whenever I'm asked to explain in a very simple word what a tag along and drag along clause is, I always refer to a situation of this kind. An investor can be in a majority position or in a minority position. So you can be either here as an investor, or you can be here. The drag along clause protects majority. So when we talk about drag along, we typically refer to a clause that protects the majority. While instead, when we talk about a tag along, typically the tag along is a clause that protects the minorities. So the first element you must remind is drag along is the clause that protects the majority when we have in front of us the possibility to exit an investment. Vice versa, the tag along is the clause that protects the minorities. And the words in English are indicative. Drag along means to call someone to do the same thing that you do. You drag someone along. While instead, tag along is to attach a tag to something that the other party is doing. Remember this because this is the intuition behind these two clauses. In addition to this, we can, and this is how typically I explain the drag along and tag along clause, you could face two situations. Situation number one, the situation that I label as number one is an investment where the majority is owned by the entrepreneur, and instead the minority is represented by the private equity. While instead, the second situation is the opposite. It is when the private equity is holding a majority and the entrepreneur is holding the minority investment in that company. Let's start from situation number one. With situation number one, let's assume that there is an exit opportunity. And let's assume that the entrepreneur is willing to sell. Okay? So in this case, if the entrepreneur has the possibility to exit and the counterparty, the buyer of the company, is willing to buy all the company, the entrepreneur can force the private equity to sell at the same terms and conditions. So assume that I am a buyer I'm not interested in getting only the majority, but I want to buy out the full company. In this case, the entrepreneur can exercise the drag-along clause. So he can go to the private equity and say, listen, I'm forcing you, I'm obliging you to sell at the buyer with the same terms and conditions that I have negotiated with the buyer itself. Okay? On the other side, if the entrepreneur doesn't force, because this is an option, so it is not obliged to force the PE to sell, and the buyer is not willing to buy 100% of the company, you can imagine that in this circumstance, the entrepreneur sells, the buyer is happy in not buying 100% of the company. You can face, as a minority investor in this circumstance, a change of control because the majority is changing. And as a private equity, you could not be happy with the new buyer compared with the old entrepreneur. So the tag-along clause is coming into force, and in case the entrepreneur doesn't forces the private equity to sell, the tag-along clause comes into force, because if the entrepreneur doesn't force it to sell, the PE has, in any case, the option to sell. And so he exercises the tag-along at the same terms and conditions that have been negotiated by the entrepreneur. So with a situation where the entrepreneur is the majority investor, you could face two situations. One, the buyer is willing to buy 100%, and so you have two alternatives. First, the entrepreneur forces the private equity investor to sell at the same terms and conditions, and so the drag-along clause is exercised. Second possibility, the buyer is willing to buy whatever percentage stake, and so if the entrepreneur doesn't exercise the drag-along, in any case, the private equity is protected because he can exercise the tag-along clause, and so he has the possibility to sell at the same terms and conditions that have been negotiated by the majority investor. Is everything clear, guys? How the tag-along, drag-along clause works under scenario number one? In this case, scenario number one is the entrepreneur is the majority investor, and so the drag-along protects the entrepreneur. Is the approval of the buyer necessary in the second case? It is an option to sell. So it is obvious, Giovanni, that, good morning, Giovanni, it really depends on what the buyer is looking for. So if I'm happy in basically getting, say, 51%, so the control without 100%, which is rare in reality, I would say, fine. The private equity can exercise the option, but not necessarily the buyer will buy. And so the private equity will have the need to find another potential buyer. Vice versa, Giovanni, in most cases, it is very rare that in private equity you are not looking for the 100% ownership when you become the owner in a second round. And so in these circumstances, it is pretty obvious that the buyer has already declared that he's willing to get up to 100% of the stake of the company. Clarified, Giovanni, your point? Andrea, good morning, Andrea. In case the buyer wants, for example, 80% of the company and tag-along is exercised, then both PE and entrepreneur will sell each 80%, split it equally. Not necessarily, Andrea. Suppose that, for example, you are looking for 80%, and the entrepreneur is holding 75, and the private equity 25. In this case, it really depends. It is obvious that if you have agreed the sale and purchase agreement with the entrepreneur, you are already in the position to get 75%. You need an additional 5%. So from this point of view, the entrepreneur very much likely will force the private equity to sell at least 5%. And then, based on the agreements between the PE and the buyer, this 5% can eventually be increased to include the remaining 20%. After all, Andrea, if you have 80%, you will probably squeeze out the minority, asking the remainder 20%. I don't know if I have clarified your question. Okay, very good. Let me just conclude the analysis and showing you how the situation works. It is exactly the parallel with the opposite situation. Probably in this case, you will understand a little bit better why these clauses protect private equity. Suppose that in this case, you are in a situation where you are situation number two. The private equity now is holding the majority, and vice versa, the entrepreneur is the minority investor. In this case, drag along. So suppose that, again, going back to Andrea's example, we have found a potential buyer that is willing to buy 80% of the stakes. If I am a private equity and essentially I'm holding 60%, very much likely I will force, and this is a protection of the majority, the entrepreneur to sell at the same terms and conditions the stakes so that the buyer can achieve the same amount of shares is looking for. So in this case, is the private equity that forces the entrepreneur to sell. Since, however, the entrepreneur is holding a tag-along option, the entrepreneur has always, since there is a change of control, the possibility to sell at the same terms and conditions that are negotiated by the private equity investor. All in all, in a sense, it's a sort of a link in between the two protection mechanisms. Remember, every time you insert a protection for the majority, you always allow the minority to be attached, to be tagged along with what the majority has negotiated when exiting the investment. And you can understand why these clauses are important. One of the key moments when the private equity investor is basically closing the investment cycle is exactly when he exits the investment. And so we must, our lawyers, must be 100% sure that the proper protections, the proper mitigations against the possibility of a tough exit are completely swept away. And tag along and drag along are a pretty standard methodology that is used in the sale and purchase agreement for private equity and venture capital investments. Okay? Any question regarding the first point of our agenda, protection mechanisms during the exit? The combination of drag along, majority protection, tag along, minority protection. Any other question on this? Crystal clear? Andrea?
Sorry, Professor, if I may, it's again regarding, can you hear me first of all?
Yes, yes, good morning, Andrea, good morning.
Good morning, thanks a lot. It's still regarding the previous point. I was wondering, what about when the buyer wants to hold a stake like 60% and the PE investor has 70%, but also the entrepreneur wants to sell? I mean, if the tag-along option is exercised, how is split the amount sold between the PE and between the entrepreneur? I wanted to ask this.
Very good. So if I have got your point, you are looking for a 60%, 60 equity stake as a new buyer, and private equity holds 70%, and the founder, the entrepreneur, holds the remainder 30%. Okay. In this circumstance, what happens is 60%. So from this point of view, the most obvious strategy is to go to the majority, so in this case, the private equity, and say, listen, I want to buy 60%. The private equity can say, and this is probably the most obvious case, I am an holder of 70%. So it would be nonsense for me to sell you 60 and remaining only with 10% myself and 30% entrepreneur. Why so? It is obvious, because with three brains inside the company, potential conflict can arise. And so from this point of view, you can imagine, Andrea, that this is something that will not be a good situation. So very much likely the private equity investor will say, listen, if you buy 70%. And from this point of view, if the deal is closed, you will have a new buyer replacing the old private equity. In this moment, however, the entrepreneur can say, listen, do you force me to sell at the same terms and conditions? The answer is no, because the buyer has already achieved 60%. So the drag along will not be exercised. As a final protection, the entrepreneur can say, he can go to the new buyer and say, listen, you have purchased 60%. Do you want to buy my stake of 30% at the same terms and conditions? Very much likely that guy will say no, because at the end of the day, I'm looking only for 60%. So the real goal for this transaction is either that he buys 70% from the private equity and the private equity goes, or at the end of the day, the deal is a no-go, because the private equity will say no. The founder probably will not tag along simply because the other one is looking for 60 and not for 30. At the end of the day, there will not be an exit. So, Andrea, it is not a problem of proportionally splitting, because at the end of the day, you want either get in or not get in. So don't think about tag along and drag along as a way to, let me say, proportionally split, given a certain stake in between the majority and minority. If you buy a majority, you want to buy the majority, and vice versa if you want to buy a minority. I don't know, Andrea, if I have clarified your...
It's super clear. Thanks a lot, Professor.
You're very welcome. Excellent. Okay, so any other question maybe from the audience? Okay, so if there are no questions, we can move to point number 2. Point number 2, the protection mechanism for private equity and venture capitalists when going through investments in companies. In reality, the point is peculiar for investments that are executed in companies with very specific features. And I'm going to present you an example. But sometimes this security design that I'm going to show you can also be applied in more established situations where the company is already established, has a good market share. It is rare, but it is possible. Protection mechanism with the alternative design compared to common stock. Before starting, however, let's start considering the typical characteristic of a common stock: equity. Guys, can you tell me very briefly, let's do a very quick poll with your chat, which are the most important rights that a common stock gives to a shareholder holding a common stock? You can use your chat box and you can submit me your suggestions. You are an holder of a common stock. You are a shareholder. Which are the most important rights that you have when you have in your hands a common stock? Voting rights and economic rights. Very good, Mattia. So you have voting rights and economic rights. Very good. I completely agree with you, Mattia. Now, suppose that you are an holder of 30% of the equity capital of a company. Repeating what Mattia said, how many voting rights you have in that company? How many voting rights do you have in that company? Any idea? It's a trivial question. In a normal common stock, exactly, Pavel, 30%. And suppose that the company has a market cap of 1 billion euro. If you are an holder of a common stock, how much is the value you are sitting on top in a company whose market cap is 1 billion euro? If you hold an equity stake of 30%, again, a super trivial question. Any suggestion? Economic rights. So if you have a company whose market cap is 1 billion and you hold 30% of that company, how much is the value that you have in your hands? 300 million, of course. Absolutely. Completely agree with you. What you are saying, guys, is that if you use common stocks, you are entitled to exercise voting powers and be in a position to get a value corresponding to the percentage of equity stake that you have inside the company. And this is pretty obvious, okay? This is a premise that is important to show you a potential strange paradox that could happen under some peculiar circumstances. Let's make an example. Suppose that you are a venture capitalist. So you are working in companies with a high potential of innovation. Say a biotechnology company. So a group of biotech engineers that have developed a very brilliant idea. The idea has not been patented yet, but it is very close to be patented. This group of engineers approach you, venture capitalists, and say, listen, we have this fantastic idea, and you, venture capital, have the intuition that this idea can really be an icebreaker in the biotech industry. Let's assume that you give to this idea an implicit value of 9 million euros. So the potential value of the patent is 9 million if you are able to achieve the patenting of this new biotechnology drug, okay? So your idea is, you have an idea, so you are financing an idea, and this idea, the potential patent, has a value of $9 million or 9 million euro. Okay? These biotech engineers approaches you and say, listen, well, you understand that our idea is valuable. However, we have not patented yet this idea. We need to make other investments to arrive at patenting. And the investment required to arrive at patenting is, say, 3 million euro. The engineers, so 9 million euro the idea, 3 million euro the investment required to make that idea go with the patenting. The engineers comes to you and say, listen, we have the idea, we have the brain, but we don't have 3 million. So guess what? we enter in an agreement with you, private equity, and say, listen, if you give me 3 million to develop this new drug, I will leave you a control of 3 million over 9 million, 1/3. So from this point of view, the deal could be, if you finance my idea, you will give me 3 million in exchange for 1/3 of the capital of the company. So 1/3 of the capital goes to the venture capital, to VC. And so, assuming that, as it frequently happens, we are using common stocks. So we have arrived at T0 when we enter the investment with an agreement whereby the company will be split now 2/3 the biotech engineers, the originator of the idea, and 1/3 venture capitalists. Majority represented by the biotech engineers, minority represented by the venture capitalists, the private equity investor. Make sense? Super clear. And we are using common stocks, pure common stocks. So, as Pavel was saying, if this company is worth 9 million, 30% will be mine, venture capitalists, 2/3 will be the founders, the biotech engineers, 6 million, okay? And we have the split of voting rights, 30% to the venture capitalists and 60% to the founding members, the biotech engineers. Now, assume this strange situation, which is not strange at all. Suppose that in T1, so after, say, 2 years, the biotech engineers approach, let's say, a pharmaceutical company, and they agree to sell the company at a value. So the founders decides to sell to a pharma company. Please notice that in T0, the engineers have made a contribution in kind. So they haven't invested money. They have given brain, know-how, and skills. So in terms of financial investment, the financial investment has been made by the venture capitalist and not by the founders. So the founders have simply contributed their potential idea to be patented, and that's it. Okay? I provide my time, I provide my work, I provide my brain, but at the end of the day, I haven't provided money. The full money to patent the idea has been provided by the venture capitalist. In T1, the founders go to a pharma company and say, listen, we are ready to sell you this idea. And so our company that we have set up with the venture capitalist investment 1 year before, and let's assume that the selling value for 100% of the company is 3.6 million. Remember that if a drag along clause is in place, you can drag the private equity investor to sell at the same terms and conditions. So 3.6 million fully equity sale value in T number 1. Curiously, what happens if you have used common stocks can be a paradox of this kind. You know that this company is split in 2 parts. 2/3 to the biotech engineers, and so 2/3 times 3.6 is 2.4 million. In terms of gain or loss for these investors, since in T0 they haven't invested any money because they have only given the promise to develop a drug, the net profit for this investor is 2.4 million. Are you following me? Super easy. While instead, from the point of view of the venture capitalist has the right to obtain 3.6 million times 1/3 to the venture capitalist of private equity. So I have the possibility to get 1.2 million euros, but in front of an investment of 3 million euros that I made in T0. So that, guess what? I have put all the money in the investment and I have been screwed up by the founders because I have generated a net loss of 1.8 million euros, which, if you think, is the obvious consequence of having used the split 1/3, 2/3 that Andrea and Pavel's mentioned during the chat box poll. And this is a classic paradox that can happen, particularly when companies are very young. They are based on brilliant ideas, very close to make it breaking up in the market. And at the end of the day, you are facing an unpleasant situation. Even more so if you are linked to the entrepreneur with tag-along and drag-along clauses. Simply unacceptable. So if you are using common stocks, be prepared to face such an unpleasant situation. And so it is clear, I believe, that you can't use simple common stocks, particularly when the uncertainty regarding the value and the intangibility of the value is very much emphasized. High-tech, pharma, biotech are all sectors where high-intensity R&D is exposing venture capitalists to such kind of risk. Okay? Is it clear the paradox why we can't use simply common stocks? Is there any question before I move one step forward in order to see the different security design? Because this is the core of what venture capitalists typically use. Any question? Crystal clear? Okay, if it is clear, the story goes that common stock is not a good security design, so we move away from common stocks to some form of different security design. And this stock is in general belonging to the family of preferred stocks. So there is a sort of preference for the venture capitalist. And in general, these preferred stocks work in this way. Going back to our example, where the investment was 3 million, the basic idea is that the venture capital say, listen, let's set up a design of a stock that is playing this way. Until the selling value of the company does not reach 3 million, all the 3 million is basically something that I will take for myself. So up to 3 million, all the value goes to venture capitalists in order to compensate for the original investment. And then the delta value, so the value above 3 million, will basically be split in between the venture capitalist and the entrepreneur. So in our example, if we have a total consideration of 3.6 million euro in T1, this 0.6 million will be split in between the venture capitalist and let's call them the founders. Okay, makes sense. It is more logical. It is probably more equitable toward the venture capitalist. and at the end of the day gives a downside protection to the venture capitalist. Until my investment has not been repaid, nothing can be paid to the founders. Okay? From this point of view, the real discriminant between the different families of preferred stocks is not this part. This part is equivalent for all the preferred stocks. What makes the difference is the way we will split the extra value between the founders and the venture capitalist. And in reality, there are two big families of preferred stocks, and we are going to analyze them separately. The first one is the so-called CPS, also known as convertible preferred stocks. And the other one is the RPS, so-called redeemable preferred stocks. We are going to analyze both of them, and we will try to understand how this split takes place, okay? Using, again, our example of an investment 3 million, an exit value 3.6, and essentially the 0.6 delta value to understand how this value is split, okay? Let's start from the convertible preferred stocks. CPS. We are talking about convertible. So with the convertible preferred stocks, essentially the venture capitalist or the private equity holds an option always to convert the CPS, the convertible preferred stocks, the preferred stock, into common stock. So our attention must be on the possibility to convert the stock. Remembering that if you convert into common stock, you will have a payout that will be represented by 1/3 times the sale value of the company. So if you convert, you will receive 1/3 of the sale value. If you don't convert, you have a stock that pays you an amount of 3 million euro. Let me just explain with a graph that can explain you a little bit better how this kind of security works. Horizontal axis, the potential selling value of the company in T1. Okay? Selling value in T1. On the vertical axis, you have the payout for the venture capitalist or the private equity. Do you remember? Preferred stocks say up to 3 million euro, everything goes to the venture capitalist. So the first important point of reference for our graph is 3 million, the original investment. You know that until you don't achieve 3 million, all the money goes to the venture capitalist. And so the payout in this part of the graph is a line with a slope of 1. From 3 million onwards, you always have this possibility. You can decide to stay with your convertible preferred, and if you don't convert, you have the right to receive 3 million euro. And instead, if you convert, you will have the possibility to get 1/3 of the selling value. Let's make an example. Suppose that the founders find the possibility to sell at 6 million euros. Clearly, if you don't convert, you always keep going on getting your 3 million euro. as a convertible preferred stock. If instead you convert, you have the right to receive 1/3 of the selling value of the company. 1/3 times 6 million, which is 2 million euros. In these circumstances, guys, will you convert this security into a common stock or not? Any idea? With 6 million, assuming that if I don't convert, I get 3, and if I convert, I get 2. Will I convert? Absolutely not at all. Not unlike the company reaches exactly, Charles, 9 million. So the idea is, until you don't, as Charles say, the conditions to convert, as you can imagine, as Charles suggests, condition to convert is that 1/3 times sales value is higher than 3 million, or sale value is higher than 9 million. So as Charles, thanks Charles for your suggestion, and thanks Andrea for yours, until we don't achieve 9 million, at the end of the day you will not convert, and so you will be stuck until 3 million euro value. Starting from 9 million, you convert, and then you become a common shareholder. For example, if the selling value is a value of 12 million, at this point, clearly, if I don't convert, I receive 3 million. If I convert, I receive 12 million times 1/3, or 4 million euros. This is the value I receive, 4 million euros. So the payoff is a typical function where you have the first part up to 3 million, all paid to the venture capitalist, no conversion area that keeps the value at a reasonable value of 3 million, and then the conversion area that makes the gain proportional to the amount generated by the selling of the company. Okay? Convertible preferred stock. Downside protection, 3 million, and then the split corresponding to the selling value of the company itself. Okay? Any question on the convertible preferred? Sufficiently clear? Crystal clear for everybody, guys? Okay. If it is clear, let's see the alternative, the redeemable preferred stock. With the redeemable, the payoff is even more intuitive, in a sense that, in this case, the idea is with an RPS, redeemable preferred stock, redeemable, the payoff is even more intuitive. Up to 3 million downside, again, all to venture capitalists, to the venture capitalist. The extra value, well, super simple. 1/3 to the venture capitalist, 2/3 to the founders. So it is probably the easiest and the most intuitive kind of payoff you might have inside this particular kind of securities. So let's see again with the plotting a chart, what happens? Again, selling value, potential selling values, and here you have the payout for the venture capitalist or private equity. Now, again, let's start to analyze the first leg of the redeemable preferred. Up to 3 million, all to the venture capitalist. Exactly the same as in the previous case. 3 million. Until you don't achieve 3 million, all the money goes to the venture capitalist. So the line, the slope is 1. And then you split the extra value. So every potential upside is split according to the proportion 1/3, 2/3. So essentially the idea is that you go up with a slope of 1/3. Oh, I forgot to say, in the previous example, the slope of this part is, as you can imagine, 1/3. So to say that, again, suppose to consider the previous example where we had a selling value of 12 million. With the selling value of 12 million here, repeating our split, we know that at 12 million, the venture capitalist will receive the downside, 3 million, plus 1/3 of the extra value. So 1/3 of the difference between 12 million and 3 million. This difference is 9 million. 1/3 of 9 million is basically 6 million. So at this value here, our venture capitalist will receive the value of 6 million. Is it sufficiently clear, guys? This is even more intuitive than the convertible preferred stock. And so it is something that really gives you full protection against the downside and essentially a little bit of upside when the values are particularly relevant. Is it clear how a redeemable preferred stock works? Any particular question from this point of view? Tell me if something is not clear. Crystal clear for everybody? Crystal clear for everybody, guys? Okay, all fine. Thanks, Leonardo. Thanks for your feedback. One point to your attention. Look carefully at the two charts. If you look at the two charts, you see that in redeemable preferred, with a value of 12 million, you get 6 million. While instead, in the convertible preferred, with a value of 12 million, you receive a much lower amount of 4 million. And you can imagine that if you overlap the two charts, for very high selling values, the redeemable preferred generates a much bigger upside than the convertible preferred. This is obvious because the slope of the curves is different. For this reason, sometimes in order to, let me say, limit the maximum amount that the venture capital receives when getting convertible preferred or redeemable preferred, there are some mechanisms that the two parties, the engineers, the biotech, and the venture capitalist insert in order to, let me say, cap a little bit the amount of money that is paid to the venture capitalist. And so the idea is that exactly because sometimes the company can be really a groundbreaker and the value at which you sell the company is very high, for very high selling value, for very high selling values, the entrepreneur that is not stupid will try to limit the gain for the venture capitalist. And so for very high selling values, typically you have two protection mechanisms, typically agreed in between the entrepreneur and the venture capitalist. The first one is essentially basically to impose the conversion in common stocks after a given selling value has been achieved. So imposition of a conversion in common stocks after, let me say, a threshold of sale value, And this is the first potential mechanism. For example, let's make an example. Suppose that you fix a threshold at 24 million euros. Okay? So, if you have a normal redeemable preferred, you will get a significant amount of money. Because if this is sell value and this is the payoff to venture capitalists, the idea we saw is, using our example, this is 3 million, this is 3 million, this is a slope of 1/4, or 1/3, sorry. This is 1. With a normal redeemable preferred at 24 million, with a normal redeemable preferred, remember 3 million plus 1/3 of the extra value. My question for you is, with a normal RPS, how much would you get when the selling value of the company is 24 million euros? Let's run a quick poll. 10 million? The answer is yes, Charles. Thanks very much. Why? Because you said, if I understand your number, with a normal RPS, you will receive the downside, 3 million, plus all the extra value coming from the difference between the selling value, 24 million, and 3 million investment times 1/3. This is 21, this is 7, 7 plus 3 is 10 million euro. Okay, so in normal circumstances, you would get 10 million. With this protection here, you impose the conversion in common stocks after this threshold is achieved. So at 24, you impose the conversion in a common stock. But with common stocks, with a value of 24 million euro, how much you would receive if you are a pure common shareholder? Remember the common share. If you are 8 million, correct, 24 million times 1/3, it is 8 million. So, guys, look carefully at how this payoff is changed. With the normal redeemable preferred, you would have received Charles' value, 10 million, while instead, if you say that after a barrier represented by 24 million, you are forced to convert, essentially you have a shift downward, always with the slope of 1/3. But at 24 million, you receive only 8 million. So your function now is a function that has the downside protection, the split 1/3, 2/3, and then the forced conversion. Okay? This is exactly to limit at a certain point the amount of money that is basically paid to the venture capitalist. Is it clear? So a threshold of value after which there is an imposition to convert the redeemable preferred stock into a normal common stock. Sufficiently clear, guys? First way to limit the gains for very good. Thanks, Charles. Now, the second mechanism of protection is this second one, a little bit more tricky. Second protection. With this second protection, the entrepreneur, the biotech engineers, say that let's fix, rather than a threshold after which I will ask you to convert, a maximum cap of value obtained by the venture capitalist. For example, let's fix a multiple 2 times the investment. Okay? And in this case, let's assume that I give you the possibility to get extra value, but I cap you at 2 times the investment, which is a good multiple. Do you remember our investment? Our investment was 3 million euros. So we fix a cap at 2 times 3 million euros, 6 million euros. And basically the idea is I give you at 6 million the possibility to convert or non-convert into common stocks, into common stocks. Let's reason in this way, guys. The idea is, if I give you a cap of 6 million, how much is the implicit value of sale that generates this 6 million? We can reason in this way. 3 million, the original investment, plus the difference between the sale value and 3 million times 1/3. So the idea is I will reach the cap of 6 million when this sale value will be how much you can solve the equation, and then you can easily see that this value is 12 million. In fact, 12 million minus 3 is 9 million. 1/3 of 9 million is 3 million. 3 million plus 3 million is 6 million. So look carefully at what happens in this circumstance with the imposition of a cap and the possibility to convert. This is another transformation of our traditional payoff of a redeemable preferred in order to limit the upside. This is the selling value, the potential selling values. This is the payoff for the venture capitalist. Again, 3 million, nothing changes. 3 million, 3 million, and the usual slope of 1. Then the second area where the redeemable preferred works normally until I reach the cap. This is the cap, 2 times the investment, and this is 6 million. So in this part of the function, the redeemable preferred works perfectly. Now, from this moment on, this function becomes again a convertible preferred, like the previous example. You always have the possibility to convert or not to convert. So the idea is, suppose, for example, that this is, as we said, the corresponding value of 12 million, because we have calculated the implicit selling value that determines a cap of 6 million. Suppose to take a value of 15 million. You have now the possibility to convert or not convert, convert or no convert. If you convert, you will get common stocks, 1/3 times 15, 5 million. While instead, if you don't convert, you will keep going on receiving 2 times the investment, or 6 million. Will I convert or not? At 15 million? Guys, suppose that the selling value is 15 million. No, no convert, absolutely not. Can I ask you, which is the threshold where you exercise the conversion? Remember the convertible preferred. You must be 18 million, correct. It is exactly 18 million. It is exactly 18 million. You are exactly on the ball. You will convert, so there is an area of no conversion. This is the no conversion area. No conversion. And indeed, you will not convert until the selling value times 1/3 doesn't exceed the 2 times investment for 6 million, 18 million euros. Okay, so at 18 million, you will again start to convert with a slope of 1/3. You see how the payoff of this has been transformed and kept to a maximum amount. Sufficiently clear, guys? So you see that this is a security design in all sense. We have a piece of blank paper, and we have set up an agreement where we have tried to limit the loss, the downside, for the venture capitalist. And in the meanwhile, with the transformation of a regular redeemable preferred, which is the most favorable security design for the venture capitalist, to limit the possibility of the excessive upside, if you want, wealth expropriation from the venture capitalist compared to a normal convertible preferred. Any question, any doubt in terms of the slope and the shape of the different functions? Sufficiently clear, guys? Very clear. Thanks very much, Matteo, for your feedback. So, fine. If it is everything is clear, we can now turn to again our agenda for the day and move to the final part of our discussion, the introduction to replacement capital, LBOs. This is just an introduction because on Wednesday we will have the possibility to meet with one large investor, pan-European investor, Alvarez & Marsal Capital, and with Mr. Alessandro Luongo, a managing director of that company. And so we will have the chance to see how really replacement capital funds work. But in order to shape a little bit an introductory part, let's just introduce a couple of points that can be useful in order to introduce what Mr. Luongo will tell us during his speech. So going back to our agenda, an introduction to replacement, LBOs. In reality, LBOs are sort of a bridge in between this module, the module of private equity, and the module that will be under the control of Professor Della Ragione, the mergers and acquisition that is going to start after the Easter break. And in fact, LBOs can be imagined as the sum of two aspects. On one side, they are essentially mergers and acquisitions. More precisely, the LBO is an acquisition, so it is a buyout. So you buy a company that is currently owned by another group of shareholders, and this acquisition is carried out with typically an intense use of debt. Intense use of debt. And the reason why the bridge in between Professor Della Ragione part and mine is there is because this acquisition very frequently is sponsored, this is the technical term, it is originated, if you want, by private equity investors. By private equity investor with a strong focalization on replacement capital. This is the world of replacement, so no capital increase, no equity injection in the company whatsoever. This is simply a way to change the ownership of a company with new shareholders that are getting inside the company itself. So from this point of view, it is a complete and a horse with a different color in all sense. What is, in all sense, an LBO? So, how we can approach an LBO transaction? In order to do so, I have prepared in your set of slides. This set of slides will be made available at the end of this session. So don't be afraid not having found them in your Blackboard. They will be put this afternoon in your Blackboard simply because I have fresh data published by PitchBook and I have to upload them. So don't be afraid. For the time being, the only thing I ask you is to consider an example that I'm going to show you. And this example that introduces our topic is basically the following. Suppose that we are talking about an acquisition. And let's assume that you have a target company whose values are the following. So this is our TICO target company, also known as the OpCo, operating company, the company that is in place and is generating cash flows, operating company. Let's assume that this company has the following values. We have, like in your slide that you will see in the presentation, the following values here. We have assets for 3,000, a goodwill of 1,000, and liabilities 2,000. So essentially we have assets 3,000, assets 3,000, a goodwill of 1,000, the difference between the book value and the economic value, the equity of this company to be 1,000, and the liabilities of, as you can see, equity 1,000, 4,000, liabilities 3,000. If I remember well the numbers, let me see if I'm doing the right number. Liabilities 2,000. Okay, liabilities 2,000. Liabilities 2,000. And equity, the difference between 4,000 on the asset side and liabilities here, 2,000. Okay. As you know, at the beginning, TICO is owned by the shareholders of TICO, the current shareholders. Our objective is to buy out this company 100%. So the idea is to set up a leveraged acquisition, LBOs. The typical phases of an LBO are pretty standard and essentially are based on the following steps. The first step is essentially the creation of the acquisition vehicle. Creation of the acquisition vehicle. This is a special purpose vehicle with the sole purpose to buy out the shares of TICO from the shareholders of TICO. This is also known as NewCo, a new corporation, or a special purpose entity. These are all synonyms. Suffice it to say that this is an empty shell that includes only the cash that will be used to pay out the shareholders of TICO. As you can imagine, this NewCo must collect in the marketplace 2,000 because this is the value of the shares that shareholders of TICO owns in TICO company. So the idea is to set up this SPV, the NewCo company, with cash. I'm simplifying a lot. In reality, you will never see cash because cash will be immediately disbursed to the shareholders of TICO for an amount of 2,000. Let's assume that the structure of financing of this cash is composed by 3 layers: senior debt, senior acquisition debt, equity, and this equity is provided exactly by PE LBO funds and for a certain amount by the management of the company. And the third layer, which is an hybrid instrument, is typically represented by MEZ, mezzanine debt. What is MEZ? We will see it in restructuring, but typically MEZ is an hybrid instrument that has basically features of both equity and debt. More precisely, the MEZ debt is typically a debt, but a debt that is subordinated. So the idea is this MEZ financing can be paid only after the senior debt has been paid. And second, it typically provides a so-called equity kicker. Typically, this equity kicker is represented by warrants. So the idea is to allow these junior creditors to buy out a portion of the shares in the combined entity resulting from the acquisition from the equity holders. Okay? So the idea is I want to collect these 2,000 and I decide to finance this 2,000 with a combination of equity 30%. So I decide to inject 30%, of which 40% represented by the management of the company and 60% by the private equity investors, a 20% mezzanine, and a 50% senior debt. So the idea is 50% senior debt. I have to collect 2,000. 50% senior debt is 1,000. So I will go to banks for syndicated bank facilities syndicated bank loans 1,000, another 20% in terms of mezzanine, and so another 400 million, and then the equity for the remaining 30%. Split 40% of the management, so this 30% is 600, 30% times 2,000. Management holds 240, and the private equity LBO funds get the remaining 360, 60% times 600. The vehicle now is ready, and is ready to carry out the acquisition. So the idea is phase number 2, and with this phase, I stop my discussion today, leaving the floor to final questions. I carry out the acquisition strict sense. Acquisition. What is the meaning of the acquisition? Meaning of the acquisition, dotted blue line. I take this cash. I disburse this cash to the shareholders of TICO, and the shareholders of TICO gives me their equity stake, 100% of TICO shares. That from now on represents the exclusive asset that the NewCo company has on the left-hand side. So the LBO, in a nutshell, as you can see from this very simplified chart, is the creation of a NewCo with the sole purpose to generate and to collect cash and to spend this cash to buy out 100% of the shares of the existing shareholders of the TICO company. Okay? And I see that I have almost exhausted my time. So there are a couple of minutes to dedicate to final Q&A if there is any particular question regarding our session. More than pleased to collect and to address them. Any question, guys? Crystal clear for everybody? Okay, so if everything is clear, what to say? As always, it has been a pleasure to stay with you in this virtual class. Always a lot of activism, and I really appreciate that. I wish you all the best until Wednesday. On Wednesday, we will have the possibility to meet our second distinguished guest speaker of the series, Mr. Alessandro Luongo from Alvarez and Marsal Capital, and we will continue the analysis of replacement capital. For the time being, guys, it has been a pleasure to talk to you, and talk to you soon again on Wednesday. In the meanwhile, take care and stay safe. Bye-bye. Take care.